We already learned a lot about the core fundamentals of React, especially this JSX thing, which is super important to get right and to understand. But I also mentioned in the first module of the course that React is all about components. You build your application with components, and React is a library which makes building these components so easy. Well, right now we're only using one component. Time to change this. And for this, I'll add a new file in the source folder of our project. I'll actually even add a new folder, and I'll name it person with a capital P. This is kind of the convention in React. You don't have to do that, but you give your components, the files where you create them, capital starting characters. And you describe what this component is basically there for. And here I want to render some information about a person. Inside that person folder, which is stored in the source folder, I'll create a person.js file. Again, following this convention of having a capital starting character and describing what this component is about. Now in there, I want to create a component. And we already did this. Actually, we got this out of the box in the app.js file by extending the component class from the React library. We can absolutely use this approach, and it will become more important later when you also learn about state, which basically allows you to change your component at runtime, you could say. But most of the time, you should use a different form of component or of creating components. A bare function, a simple JavaScript function. Because in its simplest form, a component is just a function which returns some JSX, some HTML, you could say. Now, of course, you can create a function with the function keyword. You could name it person, here with a lowercase starting character, which also is kind of convention here. You could use a capital one though. And then you could return some JSX here. You can absolutely do that. You could also use the ES5 syntax of creating a variable which holds a function which in the end would result in the same. But I will use ES6 in this course, which I strongly recommend doing. It is kind of the best practice when creating React projects. It gives you access to many new and modern features. Hence, I will create a variable not with the var keyword, but with the const keyword, because I don't plan on changing this variable, effectively making it a constant, and hence we should mark it as such. I'll name it person with a lowercase character. As I said, you could choose person with uppercase P, but you often see the function name being all lowercase. It should otherwise be the same name as your file name though, or as the component name you want to use. Then I will assign a value to this variable, or constant to be precise, and this should be a function. Now I could again use function here, but actually I want to use the ES6 function syntax, this arrow function syntax. So I will say equal argument list, arrow, function body. This is just the ES6 equivalent to the function created with the function keyword. It holds some advantages, especially when it comes to the this keyword though. So I strongly recommend using this syntax. If this is brand new to you, now you know it, and in general, you might be interested in also diving into some ES6 courses or learning materials to simply learn about all the awesome features ES6 has to offer, like this one. Back to the syntax though. We effectively have a function here. And as I said, in its simplest form, a component is a function returning some JSX. So let's do that. Let's return some JSX. And we could simply return a paragraph here where I say, I'm a person. Now this alone creates a valid function which we could use as a component, but we also have to do two other things. Do you have an idea what we have to do? For one, we need to import React, because keep in mind, this JSX syntax is transformed to React create element. And to be able to call this method, we need to import React with a capital R from the React package, like this. So just as we do in app.js here. We don't need the component though, because here we're not using a class which extends component, instead we're creating a function. We still need to export that function though as the default of this file. Here we export this person constant which holds this function. With that, let's save the file so that this dot up here disappears and we only see the cross. And now we can start using this component in other files of our project. Namely, in the only other component, our root component we have yet in the app.js file. There, I will add an import and I will import person. This name is now totally up to you, but it should be the name of your component starting with a capital character from /, because it's a relative path, the person folder, so referring to this folder, which is in the same path as the app.js file, and there the person.js file, though we can omit the .js because it's added automatically by the build workflow. Now it's important that you give this a name which starts with a uppercase character. You could choose any other name, it doesn't have to be person, though it makes sense to use the name of your component, but it should have an uppercase character. Because in React, in JSX, all elements starting with lowercase characters like div or h1 are reserved for the native HTML elements. So you could create your own component which you name div with an uppercase D. And then React could use that because it wouldn't interfere with the normal div. And for the same reason, you should give your person the uppercase character so that React identifies it as a custom component. So let's use person here, and we can either use an opening and closing tag like this, or since we don't nest anything between, I'll come back to that in the next lectures too, you can also use a self-closing tag with / and then the greater than sign at the end. With that, if you save this file too, and you now go back to your application with npm start still running in the terminal, you see I'm a person being rendered below our app component content. This is now coming from our own component, and if we inspect it, we see in the end we don't see our custom element, we just see the paragraph we're exporting in that function, and that is actually how it should be. So this is now our own component getting used. Of course, using it like this is already nice, but what exactly is the benefit of creating it like this instead of simply adding the code right into the app.js file? Let's do more with this component to see that benefit in the next lecture. In the last lecture, we created our own component, the person component. The question is, what's the big advantage of this? Components are awesome because we can focus our code in each file and hence make it much more maintainable, not put everything into the app.js file, which can really get crowded for bigger apps. And this component is also reusable and configurable. Now I'll come back to the configuring part. Reusing it is quite simple. We can simply copy it and paste it as often as we want, maybe 3 times. And by simply doing this and saving that file, we get the output multiple times, and that is a super easy way of reusing it anywhere in our application. And if our application would contain more and more components, this would make it super easy to build it up with all these components and use them wherever we need to use them in our app. This is now effectively our custom HTML element. We also can configure it though. But before we do that, let's change something else about our React code. Because right now it's all static still. We have our custom component, but in there we still just have some static HTML text, some HTML content at the end. Now, oftentimes your templates, your JSX code should be dynamic, should output different things depending on the state of your application or on some user input. Now, we will do this a lot throughout the course, but let's lay the foundations for that in the next lecture. In the last lecture, we replicated the person component. Let's now dive into outputting some dynamic content in React. Thus far, we always hard-coded some HTML elements, and I'm always saying HTML, you know it's JSX, just because it looks like HTML, I'm saying that, and some text in between. Now let's say we want to say I'm a person and I am X years old, but X should actually be a random number. Now we can simply do that. We can replace X with math random to get a random number between 0 and 1. Maybe multiply this with 30 and also use math floor to round it down. Now if we do this and save that code, well, we see this output as a text. Which makes sense. How would React know to execute this as JavaScript? After all, maybe we want to output it as a text. If we have some dynamic content in our JSX part, which we want to run as JavaScript code and not interpret as text, we have to wrap it in single curly braces. So let's wrap this in single curly braces, one in front of math floor and one after the closing parentheses. Now if we save this, we let this reload, we see I'm 0, 9 and 20 years old. And if we reload this again, we see different values because it's random. Now this is super important because this now shows us that we can output dynamic content as part of our JSX content. We can't define a JavaScript class in there or anything like that. We can execute one-line expressions, short, simple expressions like simple calculations or function calls here. That is important, by the way. I could call a function here, and this function might then do more complex stuff. We'll actually see us calling functions once we add event handlers. Now that we're able to output dynamic content, why don't we take it to the next level and make our component more dynamic so that we can leave outputting some generic content like person and a random number and instead do something else. Pass some configuration from the app.js file. Maybe some HTML attributes we pass to person to configure what we want to output for each usage of the person component. Now that we know how to output dynamic content, let's make our component configurable, flexible, and dynamic. For normal HTML elements, we can pass attributes, like class name, which we can add to any HTML attribute. An input element also would have the value attribute, for example. Now for person, it would be nice if we could say name and maybe pass max, and age and maybe pass 28. And for the second usage, we maybe want to pass menu and the age of 29. And for the third usage, we maybe want to use Stephanie and pass an age of 26. That's not my girlfriend, by the way. So if we do that, we want to output this. And maybe we even want to take it further. And for menu, we also want to split this in an opening and closing tag and also output some additional information like my hobbies, which could be racing. Now, with all of that in place, we have to change something in our person component to handle that input. Because by default, of course, if we save this and we reload the app, our output is unchanged because we're not using this information. How would we? How would React know what to do with that? Well, it actually is able to take these attributes and gives us access inside our receiving component on an object named props. Now actually the name here is up to you, but you will receive one argument in your function, one argument which is passed into it by default by React, which is an object with all the properties of this component. And properties means the attributes you add on your component. Now in React land, this is referred to as props, which is why I named this argument props, and I strongly recommend doing so that everyone else understands your code too. Theoretically, you're free to name this differently though. So now that we have props, we can get access to that name and age thing. So we could say I'm, and now use single curly braces to output something dynamic. I'm props name, and I am years old. Now here, I will keep the curly braces, but replace the random calculation with props age. I'm props name and I'm props years old. Let's now save this and let's see what happens if this now reloads in our application. If it doesn't reload, reload manually. You should see I'm Max and 20 years old, Manu, and Stephanie and all the ages. So now we're having the best of both worlds. We have a reusable component which has a clearly defined template, but in there we use dynamic content which we set from outside in the place where we actually use our component. This makes it really reusable. Think about all the possibilities which we will also explore in this course. Having an input component where you can set the type from outside. Having this person component which might be styled like a card to output dynamic or different content for the different persons. That is truly an amazing world of features we can access here, and it's one important step towards really building great and flexible components. What about the hobbies here though? Let's have a look at how we can use content which is passed not as an attribute, but between the opening and closing tags in the next lecture.